Christmas Day, American jets, Nigerian airspace, bombs falling on a sovereign nation's soil with permission. But here's what they're not telling you. That permission was shaped by weeks of pressure, diplomatic leverage, and the quiet understanding that saying no has consequences. Nigeria just became a case study in how foreign intervention happens in 2025, not through invasion, but through calculated influence. 3 neighboring countries expelled Western forces for this exact reason. They're watching, and they're warning that what just happened in Nigeria could unravel everything. You need to understand why this single strike matters more than the last decade of policy combined. On Christmas Day 2024, American warplanes crossed into Nigerian airspace and dropped ordnance on targets in the country's northwest. The official explanation: protecting Christian communities from ISIS-linked militants. The uncomfortable reality: a sovereign African nation just allowed a foreign military to conduct lethal operations within its borders under what many are calling coerced consent. This wasn't a surprise attack. Nigeria's government coordinated. They approved. But approval under pressure isn't quite the same as partnership. And what happened in the days before those strikes tells a very different story about power influence and who really decides when violence is necessary. The targets were militants affiliated with Islamic State West Africa Province, groups that have terrorized communities across Nigeria's northwest and northeast for years. Churches burned. Entire villages displaced. The violence is real, the threat undeniable. But the solution Washington offered wasn't training, wasn't intelligence sharing, wasn't even enhanced surveillance. It was bombs, American bombs, dropped by American pilots on Nigerian soil. What makes this moment so politically charged isn't the strike itself. It's what came before. U.S. officials didn't simply offer assistance. They applied pressure, diplomatic cables, security briefings framed in urgent language, implicit suggestions that Nigeria's own military capacity wasn't sufficient, that time was running out, that American intervention was the responsible choice. This is where sovereignty becomes negotiable. Nigeria's government found itself in an impossible position: refuse and risk being seen as unable to protect its own citizens, as weak, as complicit in Christian persecution. Accept and validate the narrative that African nations still require Western military force to solve internal security crises. President Bola Tinubu's administration chose the latter. They coordinated. They approved. But the optics are devastating. Because here's what this really signals: foreign policy as a debt structure. Nigeria receives American military aid, training programs, counterterrorism funding. That assistance comes with expectations, with quiet obligations. And when Washington decides that Nigerian Christians need protection, the calculation shifts. Saying no becomes politically expensive. Approval becomes the path of least resistance. This is the modern face of neo-colonial intervention. It doesn't arrive as conquest. It arrives as partnership, wrapped in the language of mutual interest and shared threats. The strikes were technically legal under Nigerian law. The government consented. But consent under duress, consent shaped by asymmetric power, consent that follows months of diplomatic pressure. Is that truly sovereignty? The regional implications are immediate. Other West African nations are watching. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, countries that have recently expelled French and American forces, see this as validation of their own suspicions. That Western counterterrorism partnerships are never truly equal. That coordination always slides toward control. Nigeria just became the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you let external powers define your security priorities. And the jihadist groups themselves? They're paying attention too. ISIS-linked militants have long framed their insurgency as resistance against Western-backed governments. Now they have proof. American airstrikes on Nigerian soil. Footage for recruitment videos. Evidence that the Nigerian state is, in their narrative, a puppet. The very intervention designed to weaken these groups may have just handed them their most potent propaganda in years. What's unfolding here is a broader question about African agency in the 21st century. Can nations in the Sahel region secure themselves without becoming client states? Can they accept foreign military assistance without surrendering decision-making authority? Or is counterterrorism cooperation inherently asymmetric, always tilting toward the interests of the more powerful partner? Nigeria is Africa's largest economy, its most populous nation, a regional power. If even Nigeria can be pressured into accepting direct U.S. military action within its borders, what does that say about the limits of sovereignty across the continent? Nigeria's foreign minister stood before international cameras and said something most politicians won't admit. His country's security crisis isn't actually about his country. Yusuf Tuggar didn't blame terrorists, didn't point to poverty or governance failures. He pointed north to Libya, to a war that ended over a decade ago but never really stopped destroying everything around it. This is the part of the story that doesn't make headlines. The part where a civil war in one nation becomes a security catastrophe for 20 others. Where the fall of a dictator in 2011 creates the conditions for insurgencies, coups, and foreign military intervention across an entire region in 2024. Nigeria's crisis, the one that just justified American airstrikes on Christmas Day, didn't start in Nigeria. It started when Libya collapsed and the weapons didn't stay buried. When Muammar Gaddafi fell, his arsenal scattered. Not just rifles, surface-to-air missiles, heavy machine guns, anti-tank weaponry. Libyan military stockpiles, unguarded and unaccounted for, flowed south across the Sahara. They moved through Niger, through Mali, through Chad. They ended up in the hands of jihadist groups, ethnic militias, and anyone with enough cash or connections. This wasn't gradual. It was a flood. And West Africa has been drowning in it ever since. The weapons fed conflicts that were already simmering. Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, ISIS affiliates in the Lake Chad Basin, separatist movements across the Sahel. What had been localized insurgencies suddenly had the firepower to hold territory, to challenge national armies, to destabilize entire regions. Libya's collapse didn't just create a power vacuum in North Africa. It armed every destabilizing force below it. But the weapons are only part of the equation. The Sahel has always been a region of movement. Pastoralists crossing borders with their herds. Traders linking markets from Senegal to Sudan. Communities that existed long before colonial powers drew lines on maps. That mobility is now a security nightmare. Because jihadist networks move the same way. They don't respect borders. They exploit the spaces where state authority is weak or absent. And as climate change dries up water sources and makes land disputes more violent, the lines between resource conflict and ideological insurgency blur completely. Then there's the migration factor. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced by violence in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. Refugee camps that become recruitment grounds. Young men with no prospects, no future, no reason to believe the state will protect them. This is where extremism finds its foot soldiers. Not through ideology alone, but through desperation, through the complete breakdown of any alternative. And just when regional cooperation might have helped contain the crisis, that option started disappearing too. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, used to function as a somewhat unified bloc. Shared intelligence, joint military operations, a sense that Sahel security was a collective problem. But after the coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, countries that expelled French and American forces and pivoted toward Russia, that cooperation fractured. The regional architecture that might have coordinated a response is now split along ideological and geopolitical lines. Meanwhile, the United States, which has positioned itself as a counterterrorism partner across West Africa, operates under restrictions that complicate everything. The Leahy Law prohibits American military assistance to foreign security forces credibly accused of human rights violations. It's a law designed to prevent U.S. complicity in abuses. But in practice, it creates a gap. Nigerian units that might be most effective against insurgents are sometimes the same units accused of extrajudicial killings or torture. So assistance gets withheld. Gaps in capability widen. and the crisis continues. This is the machinery underneath the headlines. Not a simple story of terrorism and counterterrorism. Not a binary of good governments versus bad militants. It's a regional system that collapsed in 2011 and never rebuilt. A security environment shaped by Libyan weapons, climate-driven displacement, fractured alliances, and legal frameworks that don't account for the messy realities on the ground. Tugger's admission was remarkable because it named the problem honestly. Nigerian insecurity isn't a Nigerian failure. It's the symptom of a region that lost its equilibrium over a decade ago and has been spiraling since. Every intervention, every airstrike, every foreign military presence is a response to a crisis that no single country can solve, because no single country caused it. So when American jets dropped bombs in northwest Nigeria, they weren't just targeting militants. They were attempting to manage the aftershocks of a collapse that started in Tripoli and radiated outward until it touched every border, every capital, every community across the Sahel. The question isn't whether the strikes were justified. It's whether anyone actually believes this approach can work when the root causes remain untouched, unaddressed, and getting worse. 3 countries that just kicked out Western forces are now lecturing the West on how counterterrorism should actually work. The Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, issued a statement after the Christmas Day U.S. airstrikes in Nigeria. Not condemnation, not outrage, a warning. Unilateral foreign interventions, they said, risk undermining long-term regional stability. Coming from governments that severed ties with France and the United States, that's not just criticism. It's a strategic playbook being written in real time. The AES didn't form by accident. These 3 nations, all led by military juntas that seized power in coups between 2020 and 2023, created a mutual defense pact precisely because they no longer trust Western security partnerships. They've expelled French troops, ended American drone operations, and invited Russian mercenaries in their place. So when they comment on Nigeria allowing U.S. strikes within its borders, they're not speaking as neutral observers. They're speaking as countries that already made the opposite choice. Their statement was deliberate. Effective counterterrorism, they argued, requires cooperation, intelligence sharing, and local capacity building, not short-term strikes. That phrasing is pointed. It's a rejection of the same playbook the U.S. has used across the Sahel for over a decade. Drone strikes, targeted raids, kinetic operations designed to eliminate high-value targets. The AES is saying that approach failed, that it's still failing, and that Nigeria just signed up for a strategy that doesn't work. This is where the regional fracture becomes visible. West Africa is now split between 2 models of security. On one side, Nigeria and its remaining partners, still embedded in Western counterterrorism frameworks, still accepting American military assistance, still operating under the assumption that external firepower can manage internal threats. On the other, the AES bloc, which has bet its legitimacy on the idea that sovereignty means rejecting foreign intervention entirely, even if that means higher casualties, slower progress, and dependence on Russia instead. The AES critique isn't without merit. Airstrikes do one thing very well: they kill people. High-value targets, mid-level commanders, foot soldiers. But they don't address why those people joined militant groups in the first place. They don't rebuild economies. They don't create jobs. They don't resolve land disputes or provide services in areas where the state has been absent for years. Every strike removes a threat temporarily, but the conditions that produced that threat remain untouched. Security analysts have been saying this for years, often quietly, often in reports that governments ignore. The structural drivers of extremism in the Sahel are economic, environmental, and political. Youth unemployment rates above 60% in some regions. Desertification, destroying farmland and grazing routes. Governments seen as corrupt, distant, or actively predatory. Jihadist groups don't win because of ideology alone. They win because they offer an alternative, however brutal, to state failure. And here's the uncomfortable truth: Nigeria knows this. The government's own security assessments acknowledge that military force alone cannot end the insurgency. But acknowledging a problem and solving it are very different things. Solving it requires massive investment in infrastructure, governance reform, genuine local engagement. That's expensive, politically difficult, and slow. Airstrikes are fast. They produce immediate results that can be announced, quantified, and used to demonstrate action, even if the long-term impact is negligible. The AES is betting that their approach, rejecting Western intervention, building regional coalitions, relying on local forces even when those forces are brutal or ineffective, will eventually prove more sustainable. Whether that's true is still unclear. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are not success stories. Violence has increased in all three countries since the coups. Russian mercenaries have been credibly accused of mass atrocities. The governments remain fragile, their legitimacy contested, their security situations dire. But the fact that they can issue statements like this, that they can position themselves as the alternative model, signals how much the geopolitical landscape has shifted. A decade ago, Western counterterrorism partnerships were seen as necessary, even inevitable. Now, three Sahel governments openly reject them, and their critique resonates across the region. Nigeria's decision to allow U.S. strikes is being watched not as leadership, but as a cautionary tale. What happens next could redefine how security is managed across West Africa. If Nigeria's approach works, if the strikes degrade militant capacity without triggering backlash, without fueling recruitment, without eroding sovereignty further, then the AES critique loses force. But if the strikes prove to be just another short-term fix in a conflict that keeps metastasizing, then the exit model starts looking more credible. And more African governments start asking whether partnership is worth the cost. The AES issued a warning. The question is whether anyone with the power to change course is actually listening. A foreign military conducts airstrikes inside a sovereign nation on one of the most symbolically charged days of the year, and the global response is barely a murmur. No UN Security Council emergency session. No diplomatic cables leaked to the press. Just silence. Because in 2024, African security crises have become something else entirely. Political theater where the actors are external powers. The stage is someone else's territory, and the plot never actually resolves. The Christmas Day strikes in Nigeria weren't just a military operation. They were performance. A demonstration that the United States remains operationally capable in West Africa despite being expelled from Niger, despite losing drone bases, despite the region's pivot toward Russia. The targets were real. The militants were real. But the broader function of the strike wasn't purely tactical. It was symbolic. A message to allies, adversaries, and anyone watching that American power can still project itself where it chooses, even in a region actively rejecting Western military presence. This is the machinery of modern intervention. It doesn't require occupation, doesn't require permanent bases or large troop deployments. It requires access, coordination, and a partner government willing to accept the political cost of saying yes. Nigeria provided that. And in doing so, it became the latest example of how African security challenges get externalized, how internal threats are reframed as opportunities for foreign powers to demonstrate capability, to justify budgets, to maintain relevance in regions where their influence is slipping. But here's what the strikes didn't do. They didn't address why ISIS-affiliated groups exist in northwest Nigeria in the first place. They didn't resolve the governance failures that create ungoverned spaces. They didn't tackle youth unemployment, climate-driven displacement, or the collapse of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. They eliminated targets. That's all. And in 6 months, maybe less, new targets will emerge. Because the conditions that produce extremism remain completely untouched. This is the core tension analysts keep pointing to. The gap between what military force can achieve and what actually needs to happen. Sustainable solutions aren't cinematic. They're institutional. They require functioning police forces, competent judiciaries, local governments that can deliver services. They require economic opportunities in regions where joining a militant group is often the only paying job available. They require trust between communities and the state, a relationship that decades of military crackdowns have systematically destroyed. Regional collaboration is supposed to fill that gap. ECOWAS, the African Union, bilateral agreements between neighboring countries. But collaboration requires trust, and trust is exactly what's fracturing across West Africa right now. The Alliance of Sahel States exists precisely because Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger no longer trust Western-backed frameworks. They've built their own security architecture, flawed as it is, because they believe sovereignty means rejecting the kind of intervention Nigeria just accepted. So the region is splitting. Not cleanly, not along predictable lines, but splitting nonetheless. And every time a Western power conducts operations inside an African country, that split deepens. Because it reinforces the perception that African governments can't solve their own problems, that they remain dependent on external actors, that sovereignty is conditional. It doesn't matter if the intervention is technically legal, technically coordinated. The optics are damaging. What makes this moment particularly significant is timing. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy, its most populous nation, a country that should theoretically have the capacity to manage internal security without direct foreign military action. If Nigeria can't or won't, then what does that say about the rest of the region? If a country with Nigeria's resources still needs American airstrikes to protect its territory, then the implication is that no African nation south of the Sahara can truly secure itself independently. That's a narrative with consequences. And it's a narrative the AES is actively rejecting. They're arguing that homegrown strategies, however imperfect, are preferable to foreign dependence. That building local capacity, even if slower and messier, creates more durable stability than short-term kinetic operations. Whether they're right remains uncertain, but the fact that they're making the argument and that it's resonating signals a shift in how African governments think about security partnerships. The Christmas strike will be analyzed in think tanks and policy papers as a counterterrorism operation. But its real significance is what it reveals about power, about agency, and about who gets to decide when violence is necessary. Nigeria made a choice. It was a sovereign choice. But it was also a choice shaped by pressure, by resource asymmetries, by the politics of dependency. And every similar choice that follows makes it harder to imagine a future where African nations lead their own security strategies without external scripts, external actors, and external interests shaping every scene. The theater continues. The question is whether the audience is starting to notice the same story playing on an endless loop.